Imagine a misty morning in the 13th century, deep in the forests of northern Europe. The air smells of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds are the rustle of leaves and the distant howl of a wolf. For centuries, this land has been home to pagan tribes, the Old Prussians, Lithuanians, and Livonians, who worship oak groves and tend sacred fires. They hunt deer in the woods, fish in the icy rivers, and live in small villages hidden among the trees. To them, the forest is both protector and provider, a place where the gods walk among the pines. But on this morning, something strange is happening. Far off, beyond the tree line, there's a new sound, the clatter of metal, the low murmur of voices, and the creak of wooden carts. A young Prussian boy, out gathering berries, freezes. He's heard stories from travelers, tales of men in white robes and iron armor, carrying crosses and swords, who have been moving east, converting tribes by force. Now, they're here. These men are the Teutonic Knights, warrior monks, fresh from fighting in the Holy Land. Once, they cared for wounded pilgrims in Jerusalem, but when the Christian kingdoms there fell, they needed a new mission. The Pope, eager to spread Christianity into northern Europe, gave them a special order: convert the pagans of the Baltic, by persuasion if possible, by sword if not. Why this land, you might wonder? Because it's rich in timber, amber, and furs, and because its people have resisted all previous attempts to convert them. To the Knights, it's a holy calling, a chance to win souls for God, and gain land and glory in the process. Led by their Grand Master, Hermann von Salza, the Knights arrived in 1230, not with a handful of soldiers, but with an army. They built forts of wood first, then stone, strongholds that would become bases for their campaigns. One of the first was in Marienburg, a spot where the Nogat River bends, easy to defend and close to trade routes. A castle isn't just walls, a knight might explain to his squire, as they laid the first stones. It's a statement. It says, "We are not leaving." The Prussians fought back fiercely. Their leader, Hercus Monti, was a brilliant strategist who knew every path through the forests. He led guerrilla attacks, ambushing night patrols, burning supply trains, and vanishing back into the woods before the heavy cavalry could chase them. "This is our land," he told his warriors, as they sharpened their axes. "They may have iron, but we have the forest." For years, the fighting dragged on. Villages were burned, fields destroyed, and people killed on both sides. The Knights called it a crusade, the Prussians called it a war for survival. Slowly, though, the Knights gained ground. Their stone castles proved too strong for the Prussians' wooden clubs and arrows. They brought in farmers from Germany and Poland, offering them land and freedom if they settled here. These settlers cleared forests, planted crops, and built villages, turning wild land into farmland. The Knights also brought priests, who built churches on the sites of old pagan shrines. "The oak grove is beautiful," a priest might say, as workers chopped it down, "but God's house is more beautiful." Life began to change for everyone. Prussian children learned to speak German in addition to their native tongue. Some Prussian leaders, seeing that resistance was futile, converted to Christianity and joined the Knights' service, keeping their lands but swearing loyalty to the order. Others fled north to Lithuania, where paganism still held strong. By 1283, after 50 years of war, the last Prussian stronghold fell. The Knights had won, but at a terrible cost. Half the native population was gone, either killed, enslaved, or driven away. As the smoke cleared, a new kind of society emerged. The Knights ruled as a military religious state, with their Grand Master as both spiritual and political leader. They divided the land into districts, each run by a knight, and enforced strict laws based on German customs. Trade flourished, amber from the coast was sent to Germany and Italy, while cloth and tools flowed back. The forest, once a barrier, became a resource, its timber used to build ships and homes, its furs sold in distant markets. Yet even in victory, the knights faced questions. Were they truly spreading God's word, or just taking land? What happened to the Prussians' old ways, the stories, the rituals, the connection to the forest? Some knights wondered, but most pushed on, building more castles, bringing in more settlers, and dreaming of expanding farther east. As night fell over Marienburg, the largest castle in Europe, the knights gathered in the great hall for prayer. Outside, the forest whispered, as if remembering the people who once called it home. Inside, the knights sang hymns, their voices echoing off stone walls. They thought they had created a new order, a Christian paradise in the north. But history is full of surprises, and this was just the first chapter in the story of a land that would one day be called Prussia. As the 13th century turned to the 14th, the Teutonic Knights weren't just building castles, they were building a kingdom. What began as a few wooden forts in the wilderness grew into a network of stone strongholds, each linked by roads and rivers, each a piece of a larger puzzle. By 1300, over 100 castles dotted the Baltic landscape, from the Vistula River to the Gulf of Finland. These weren't just military outposts, they were the bones of a new state, where stone and faith would shape life for centuries to come. Take Marienburg Castle, now Malbork in Poland, the crown jewel of the knights' realm. Begun in 1274, it spread across 52 acres, making it the largest brick castle in Europe. Its walls rose 40 feet high, with towers that loomed over the surrounding countryside like silent sentinels. Inside, there were stables for 500 horses, workshops for blacksmiths and carpenters, and a great hall where 2,000 knights could gather for feasts. But Marienburg was more than a fortress. It was the capital, home to the Grand Master's palace, a treasury filled with amber and silver, and a cathedral where priests said Mass daily. Why build something so grand, a visiting merchant might ask. A knight would smile, gesturing to the spires. To show that God is with us, and that we are here to stay. Other castles served as regional hubs. Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, guarded the Baltic coast, its harbor bustling with ships carrying timber and furs to Germany. Elbing, Elblog, became a trading center, where Hanseatic League merchants bartered cloth and spices for local amber. Even smaller castles, like Ragnit, Nemmen, were vital. They housed district commanders, stored grain for lean years, and served as courts where knights judged disputes. Together, these castles formed a web, allowing the knights to govern a vast territory with surprising efficiency. A message sent from Marienburg could reach any corner of the realm in a week, fast for a time when most people never traveled more than 10 miles from home. But stone walls alone couldn't hold a kingdom. The knights knew they needed to change how people thought and lived, a cultural transformation that would outlast any castle. They started with religion. Pagan shrines were torn down, and churches rose in their place. Priests traveled from village to village, baptizing children and teaching the Lord's Prayer in German. For the native Prussians, this was confusing. Our gods lived in the forest, an old woman might mutter, watching as a church bell rang. Where do these new gods live? Her children, though, would grow up with crosses around their necks, their first words of prayer in a language their grandparents barely understood. Language was another weapon. The knights ordered that German be used in schools, courts, and markets. Prussian parents were told to name their children Hans or Gretchen instead of native names like Vilius or Beirut. Over time, the old tongue faded, surviving only in remote villages or in words for plants and animals that even the knights couldn't replace. Why force a new language, a young Prussian man might ask his German-speaking teacher. Because a people who speak the same language, the teacher replied, think the same way. Laws changed too. The knights brought in legal codes from Germany, replacing ancient Prussian customs. For example, Prussians had once settled disputes with duels or payments of cattle. Now, they went to court, where a knight judged them according to written rules. Theft, once punished with a fine, now meant flogging or exile. These laws were strict, but they were also consistent, and for many, that was a relief. At least you know what happens if you break the rules, a farmer might say, compared to the arbitrary justice of local chiefs. To make their new system work, the knights needed people to run it. They created a hierarchy as sturdy as their castles. At the top was the Grand Master, who lived in Marienburg and made all major decisions. Below him were commanders, who ruled districts from their castles. Priests handled religious matters, while secular officials managed taxes, trade, and roads. Even the knights themselves were divided. Brother knights fought and governed, brother priests prayed and taught, and brother servants cooked, cleaned, and repaired armor. Everyone had a place, and everyone answered to someone above them. This order extended to everyday life. Farmers worked land owned by the knights, giving a third of their crops as rent. In return, they got protection from raiders and access to markets. Craftsmen, blacksmiths, weavers, potters, set up shops near castles, where they could sell their wares to knights and settlers. Trade boomed. Amber from the Baltic was carved into jewelry for nobles in Paris and Prague, grain from Prussian fields fed cities in Germany, furs from Lithuanian forests warmed wealthy merchants in Venice. The knights taxed every transaction, filling their coffers to build more castles and hire more soldiers. Not everyone accepted the new order. Some Prussians fled to Lithuania, where pagan rulers welcomed them. Others rebelled, like the uprising of 1260, when Hercus Monti's followers briefly captured several castles. But these revolts were crushed, and each defeat made the knights more determined to stamp out resistance. Over time, most Prussians learned to adapt. They attended church, spoke German, and paid their taxes. Some even became knights themselves, converting to Christianity and marrying German settlers. Better to join them than fight them, a Prussian chief might say, as he watched his son ride off to train with the knights. By the early 14th century, the Teutonic Knights had built something remarkable, a state where stone castles defined power, German culture dominated daily life, and every person knew their role. It wasn't perfect, many resented the foreign rulers, and the old ways weren't forgotten, but it worked. The forests were tamed, trade flourished, and the knights' flag flew from the Vistula to the Baltic. As dusk fell over Marienburg, the Grand Master stood on his castle's highest tower, looking out at the realm he and his brothers had built. Below, a priest said evening mass, his voice carried on the wind. Farmers headed home from their fields, singing German hymns they'd learned as children. A ship sailed into the harbor, loaded with amber bound for Germany. For a moment, all seemed right. But history is full of surprises. The knights thought their stone walls and strict laws would last forever. They didn't know that empires, even those built on faith and stone, can crumble. For now, though, their kingdom thrived, a testament to what belief, organization, and a little bit of force can create. The sun that had once shone so brightly on the Teutonic Knights began to dim as the 15th century wore on. Their stone castles still stood tall, but cracks were appearing in the walls, both literally and figuratively. Years of war, overspending, and growing resentment from the people they ruled had weakened the once mighty order. What had been a holy mission was now seen by many as little more than greedy conquest. And then, in 1525, a single decision would shatter the old order forever, bringing a new dawn to the land, the birth of the Prussian duchy. To understand how this happened, let's rewind a little. By the early 1400s, the Knights were in trouble. Their endless wars with Poland and Lithuania, once justified as converting pagans, now looked like simple land grabs, especially after Lithuania's ruler, Gediminas, converted to Christianity in 1387. Suddenly, the Knights had no good reason to keep fighting their Christian neighbors, but old habits die hard. In 1410, disaster struck. A combined Polish-Lithuanian army crushed the Knights at the Battle of Grunwald. Thousands of Knights died, including their Grand Master, and their reputation for invincibility evaporated. How could this happen? A young squire might have whispered, staring at the returning soldiers, bloodied and defeated. We thought God was on our side. The defeat at Grunwald was just the beginning. The Knights struggled to recover, draining their treasury to rebuild their armies. Meanwhile, the people they ruled, German settlers and Prussians alike, grew tired of paying taxes for endless wars. Towns like Danzig, Gdansk, began demanding more rights, refusing to send money to Marienburg without a say in how it was spent. By 1466, after another long war, the Knights were forced to sign the Second Peace of Thorn, which split their lands. The western part, including Danzig, fell under Polish control, while the east remained with the Knights, but as a Polish vassal. They were no longer masters of their own fate. Then came the Reformation, a storm of religious change that would sweep across Europe. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, challenging the Catholic Church's teachings. His ideas spread like wildfire, that people could pray directly to God, without priests, that the Bible should be read in common languages, not just Latin, that monastic vows were unnecessary. For the Teutonic Knights, who were both monks and rulers, this was explosive. Many of their young knights, inspired by Luther, began questioning why they'd taken vows of poverty and celibacy. Why should we live like monks when we're fighting wars and ruling lands? They asked. Into this chaos stepped a young man named Albert of Brandenburg-Ansbach. A member of the powerful Hohenzollern family, Albert was elected Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights in 1510, when he was just 21. At first, he tried to save the order. He raised armies, negotiated with Poland, and even traveled to Rome to beg the Pope for help. But nothing worked. The Knights were broke, their reputation in tatters, and their own members were abandoning their vows to join the Reformation. One day, Albert sat in his study in Königsberg, reading a letter from Martin Luther himself. "You cannot serve both God and a failing order," Luther wrote. "If the Knights cannot be reformed, then dissolve them. Rule as a secular prince, and govern your people wisely." Albert thought long and hard. He loved the order's history, but he could see its end was near. In 1525, he made his decision. Gathered in the great hall of Königsberg Castle, he addressed his fellow knights and the people of the land. "The time has come for change," he declared, removing his monk's robe to reveal a prince's cloak. "I dissolve the Teutonic order in these lands. From this day forward, we are a secular duchy, and I am your duke." The room fell silent. then erupted in cheers. Many knights, tired of their vows, ripped off their own robes. Priests who supported Luther praised the decision. Even the Polish king, Sigismund I, approved. He agreed to recognize Albert as Duke of Prussia, as long as he remained a Polish vassal. The transformation was stunning. Albert married a princess from Denmark, breaking his vow of celibacy, and set about ruling his new duchy. He seized church lands and used the money to rebuild roads, schools, and fortresses. He invited Lutheran preachers to teach in Prussia, and ordered the Bible translated into German so everyone could read it. Religion should unite us, not divide us, he told his advisors. Taxes were lowered, trade with Poland and Germany increased, and for the first time in years, the land knew peace. Of course, not everyone was happy. Some older knights refused to accept the change, fleeing to other parts of Europe where the Teutonic Order still existed. Catholic priests complained to the Pope, who excommunicated Albert, though few in Prussia cared. But for most people, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, life got better. They no longer feared endless wars, and they could practice their new Lutheran faith freely. Albert's greatest legacy was linking Prussia to the Hohenzollern family. His descendants would rule Prussia for centuries, turning it from a small duchy into a European power. He also laid the groundwork for a strong, centralized state. He reformed the legal system, created a professional bureaucracy, and emphasized that service to the state, whether as a soldier, a farmer, or an official, was the highest duty. A well-run duchy is like a well-tended field, he liked to say. Everyone must do their part to make it grow. As the 16th century progressed, Prussia flourished. Königsberg became a center of learning, with a university where scholars studied Luther's writings and the latest scientific ideas. Farmers grew more crops, thanks to new techniques from Germany. Merchants in Danzig, now under Polish rule but still trading with Prussia, sold Prussian timber and grain across Europe. The old Teutonic castles were no longer just forts, they became homes for the Hohenzollern dukes, who added grand halls and gardens to show off their new status. Looking back, Albert's decision in 1525 was more than a personal choice, it was a turning point. The secularization of Prussia freed it from the rigid rules of the Teutonic Order, allowing it to adapt and grow. It tied the land to the Hohenzollerns, a family with big ambitions. And it aligned Prussia with the Reformation, connecting it to other Protestant states in northern Europe. As dusk fell over Königsberg, Albert stood on the castle walls, watching his people go about their lives, Lutheran priests teaching children, merchants loading ships, farmers bringing in the harvest. He thought of the Teutonic Knights, and their stone castles, and smiled. They built the foundation, he whispered. Now we will build something greater. While the Teutonic Knights' realm in the east was transforming into the Prussian duchy, a quieter but equally significant story was unfolding 300 miles to the west. In the sandy plains and thick pine forests of Brandenburg, a region long dismissed as a backwater of the Holy Roman Empire, the Hohenzollern family was busy assembling a puzzle, one piece of land at a time. By the 17th century, this patchwork of territories would become the foundation of something much larger, a state that would one day be known simply as Prussia. To understand Brandenburg's humble beginnings, imagine traveling there in the 1400s. The landscape is harsh, poor soil that yields little more than rye and potatoes, endless forests where wolves outnumber people, and rivers that flood every spring. Most settlements are small, clusters of thatched huts surrounded by wooden fences. The people are tough, used to scraping a living from the land and fending off raiders from Poland or Saxony. Why would anyone want this place, a traveler might ask. The answer, surprisingly, lies in its location. Brandenburg sits at the crossroads of trade routes between the Rhineland, Poland, and the Baltic. Control it, and you control the flow of goods, grain, timber, and furs, through northern Europe. For centuries, Brandenburg was a forgotten frontier, ruled by a series of minor nobles. That changed in 1415, when the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund needed a loyal ally to govern this unruly region. He chose Frederick of Hohenzollern, a member of an old southern German family known for their loyalty and administrative skill. Frederick became the first Hohenzollern Elector of Brandenburg, a title that meant he could vote for the next emperor, giving him outsized influence in imperial politics. "Treat this land like a neglected garden," the emperor advised him. "Clear the weeds, tend the soil, and it will grow." Frederick took that advice seriously. When he arrived in Berlin, the region's main town, he found a ramshackle collection of wooden buildings, a tiny castle, and a population struggling with poverty and lawlessness. Nobles, called Junkers, ruled their estates like small kings, ignoring the elector's authority. Roads were so bad that traveling 20 miles could take days. Frederick rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He negotiated with the Junkers, offering them more power over their peasants in exchange for loyalty to him. He built better roads and bridges, making trade easier. He invited skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, weavers, carpenters, from other parts of Germany, offering them tax breaks to settle in Berlin. "A town is only as strong as its people," he told his advisors, watching as new workshops popped up around the castle. Over the next 2 centuries, Frederick's descendants continued this work. They centralized power, creating a bureaucracy to collect taxes, enforce laws, and manage the land. They built schools to educate officials and priests, believing that an educated populace was easier to govern. They even reformed the legal system, replacing a jumble of local customs with standardized laws that applied to everyone. By the 16th century, Berlin had grown from a village to a proper city, with stone buildings, a cathedral, and a bustling market square where merchants from across Europe gathered to trade. But the Hohenzollerns wanted more than a well-run region, they wanted land. And they were masters of getting it through one of history's oldest tricks, strategic marriage. Instead of fighting costly wars, they married their sons and daughters to heirs of other territories, quietly adding new pieces to their puzzle. Take the example of Albert Achilles, Elector of Brandenburg in the late 1400s. He married his son to the daughter of the Duke of Pomerania, a region along the Baltic coast. When the Duke died without male heirs, Brandenburg inherited parts of Pomerania. A century later, Elector John Sigismund married Anna, the daughter of the last Duke of Prussia, the same Prussian duchy created by Albert of Hohenzollern. When Anna's father died in 1618, John Sigismund claimed Prussia for himself. Suddenly, the Hohenzollerns ruled 2 territories, Brandenburg in the west and Prussia in the east, separated by Polish lands but united under one family. Why marriage instead of war? A young prince might ask his father, watching as a delegation arrived to negotiate a new alliance. Because wars cost blood and gold, the Elector would reply, gesturing to a map covered in little flags marking Hohenzollern lands. Marriage costs only a wedding feast, and leaves you with more land than you started with. Not all acquisitions came through marriage. Sometimes, the Hohenzollerns bought land, or took advantage of chaos elsewhere in the Holy Roman Empire to seize territories. In 1609, for example, they gained parts of Cleves, Mark, and Ravensburg, rich regions in the Rhineland, after a succession crisis. These western lands were a gold mine, they had fertile farms, busy towns, and access to trade with the Netherlands. Suddenly, Brandenburg wasn't just a sandy backwater, it had a foothold in one of Europe's wealthiest regions. Integration of these scattered territories was no easy task. Each region had its own laws, customs, and even dialects. A farmer in Cleves spoke differently from a noble in Berlin or a merchant in Königsberg, the capital of Prussia. The Hohenzollern solved this by creating a common administration. Officials trained in Berlin were sent to govern distant lands, ensuring that taxes were collected the same way everywhere. They also promoted a shared identity, emphasizing that all these territories were part of the Hohenzollern realm, even if they weren't physically connected. "We may live in different places," a pamphlet distributed across the lands declared, "but we are one people, under one ruler." Religion also played a role in uniting the territories. Like their cousins in Prussia, the Brandenburg Hohenzollerns embraced the Reformation. In 1539, Elector Joachim II officially converted to Lutheranism, closing Catholic monasteries and using their lands to fund schools and hospitals. This aligned Brandenburg with other Protestant states in Northern Europe, creating a sense of solidarity against Catholic powers like the Habsburgs. It also made it easier to integrate Prussia, which was already Lutheran, into the Hohenzollern fold. By the early 1600s, the puzzle was taking shape. The Hohenzollerns ruled a collection of territories: Brandenburg, their core; Prussia, their eastern prize; and parts of Pomerania, Cleves, and the Rhineland. It wasn't a single country yet, more like a family business with multiple branches, but it was growing stronger every year. Berlin, once a provincial town, had become a proper capital, with a palace, government buildings, and a university where future officials studied law and statecraft. As the 17th century began, the Hohenzollerns looked out at their lands and dreamed of more. They knew that to become a major power, they needed to connect their scattered territories, build a stronger army, and gain recognition as more than just electors of the Holy Roman Empire. "The pieces are on the board," Elector John Sigismund said, tracing a finger across his map. "Now we just need to put them together." Little did he know that the greatest test of this project was just around the corner: the 30 Years' War, a brutal conflict that would devastate Germany but also give the Hohenzollerns a chance to prove their strength. For now, though, the puzzle was coming together, slowly, carefully, and with the quiet determination that would become a hallmark of Prussian history. The 17th century dawned over Brandenburg Prussia like a gray, smoky morning. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, had torn through the land, leaving little but rubble in its wake. Villages were burned to the ground, fields lay fallow, and towns like Berlin had lost half their population to disease, starvation, or soldiers' swords. When Frederick William, the man who would later be called the Great Elector, took power in 1640, he inherited a realm that looked more like a graveyard than a country. "How do you rebuild when everything is broken?" people whispered. The answer, as Frederick William would show, lay in two things: iron, a strong army, and taxes, a steady income to pay for it. Let's step into his shoes for a moment. At 20 years old, Frederick William arrived in Berlin to find the palace half-ruined, the treasury empty, and his nobles squabbling over what little was left. Outside the city walls, farmers huddled in makeshift huts, too afraid to plant crops in case armies came through again. Foreign powers, Sweden, Poland, Austria, treated Brandenburg Prussia like a doormat, marching their armies through its lands without asking permission. "This cannot continue," the young Elector told his advisors. "A state without strength is no state at all." His first priority was a standing army, a permanent force of professional soldiers, not just mercenaries hired for wars. At the time, most German states relied on part-time troops or hired fighters who often switched sides for better pay. Frederick William wanted something different, men who swore loyalty to him, trained year-round, and could defend Brandenburg Prussia whenever needed. In 1655, he created just that, 5,000 soldiers, paid with regular taxes, housed in barracks, and drilled until they moved like a single unit. "Why a standing army?" a skeptical noble asked. "Because when wolves are at your door, you don't borrow a dog, you keep your own," the Elector replied. Of course, an army cost money, lots of it. To pay for his soldiers, Frederick William needed a reliable tax system. Before, taxes were a mess, nobles paid almost nothing, towns negotiated special deals, and farmers were squeezed until they had nothing left. The Elector changed all that. He created a new agency called the General War Commissariat to collect taxes fairly, or at least more fairly, from everyone, nobles, towns, and peasants alike. He taxed land, trade, and even beer, something no one in Germany had dared to do before. "Taxes are like medicine," he told his people. "No one likes them, but they make the body strong." Unsurprisingly, the nobles hated this. They'd been used to special treatment, and now they had to pay their share. In 1653, they rebelled, refusing to pay the new taxes. Frederick William responded by marching his new army to their estates. "You can either pay your taxes and keep your lands," he told them, "or refuse and lose everything." Faced with the Elector's iron will, and his well-drilled soldiers, the nobles backed down. In return for their cooperation, Frederick William let them keep control over their peasants, a deal that would shape Prussian society for centuries. With money flowing in, the Elector turned to rebuilding. He invited refugees from all over Europe to settle in Brandenburg Prussia. When Louis XIV of France kicked out thousands of Huguenots, Protestants, in 1685, Frederick William sent ships to rescue them. "Come to my lands," he announced. "You'll get land, freedom to worship, and no taxes for 10 years. Tens of thousands came, bringing skills Brandenburg Prussia desperately needed: weaving, metalworking, and farming. A Huguenot weaver might set up a workshop in Berlin, a farmer might teach locals how to grow better crops in the sandy soil. Strangers today, countrymen tomorrow," the Elector said, watching the new settlers arrive. He also invested in infrastructure, building roads to connect his scattered territories, repairing bridges washed out by wars, and digging canals to make trade easier. Berlin, once a half-ruined town, was rebuilt with stone houses, a new palace, and a bustling market where Huguenot silks and Prussian grain were traded side by side. The Elector even founded schools, believing that an educated people made a strong state. "A farmer who can read will plant better crops," he said. "A soldier who can write will follow orders better." Frederick William's reforms weren't just about money and soldiers, they were about centralizing power. He created a professional bureaucracy, staffed by educated men, not just nobles, who answered directly to him. He standardized laws across his territories, so that a crime in Brandenburg was punished the same way as in Prussia. He even moved the capital from Königsberg, in Prussia, to Berlin, making it the heart of his realm. By the time he died in 1688, Brandenburg Prussia was unrecognizable. It had a 30,000-strong army, one of the largest in Germany, a balanced budget, and a growing population. The great Elector's legacy was simple but profound. He turned a weak, divided collection of territories into a cohesive state, held together by a strong army, efficient taxes, and a government that worked. He proved that even a land as battered as Brandenburg Prussia could rise again, if its ruler was willing to make tough choices. As the sun set over Berlin, Frederick William stood on the palace balcony, watching his army drill in the square below. The sound of their boots hitting the ground was like a heartbeat, a steady, strong rhythm that said, "We are here. We are strong. We will not fall." Inside, his advisors were counting tax receipts, planning new roads, and arguing over how to attract more settlers. The work was never done, but for now, the realm was on the right path. Imagine standing in the cold January air of 1701, in the courtyard of Königsberg Castle. The snow crunches underfoot, and the air smells of wood smoke and incense. Nobles in fur-lined coats, priests in richly embroidered robes, and soldiers with polished breastplates gather in a circle, their breath visible in the frosty air. At the center stands Frederick, Elector of Brandenburg and Duke of Prussia, his face serious but radiant. In his hands, he holds a crown, golden, studded with gems, and heavier than it looks. As the bishop intones the Latin blessing, Frederick places the crown on his own head. "I am now Frederick I, King in Prussia," he declares, his voice echoing across the courtyard. The crowd erupts in cheers, and cannons fire a salute from the castle walls. After centuries of struggle, the Hohenzollerns have their kingdom. But how did they get here? Frederick, known as Frederick III before his coronation, had big dreams. His father, the great Elector, had turned Brandenburg Prussia into a strong state with a powerful army. But Frederick wanted more. He wanted to be a king, not just an elector or a duke. In 18th century Europe, a crown meant respect. Kings sat at the top of the diplomatic table, they made treaties, led armies, and were treated as equals by the likes of Louis XIV of France or the Habsburg Emperor. "A elector is a servant of the empire," Frederick once grumbled to his advisors. "A king is a master of his own fate." The problem was that the Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold I, didn't want more kings in his empire. The Habsburgs had ruled Central Europe for centuries, and they saw new kingdoms as threats to their power. So Frederick had to make a deal. In 1700, the War of the Spanish Succession broke out, pitting Leopold against Louis XIV, who wanted to put his grandson on the Spanish throne. Leopold needed allies, and soldiers. Frederick offered both, 8,000 Prussian troops to fight for the emperor, in exchange for one thing, the right to call himself king. Leopold hesitated. Creating a new king in the empire was risky. But with French armies marching across Europe, he had little choice. He agreed, with a catch. Frederick could be king in Prussia, not king of Prussia. This meant his royal title technically applied only to the Duchy of Prussia, which was outside the Holy Roman Empire, not to Brandenburg or his other lands inside the empire. It was a legal trick, but Frederick didn't care. A crown by any name was still a crown. The coronation in Königsberg was a spectacle unlike anything Prussia had seen. The city, once a quiet outpost, was decked out in flags and tapestries. Foreign diplomats were invited to witness the event, to make sure Europe took notice. Frederick wore a velvet cape lined with ermine, and his new crown was modeled after the crowns of ancient Israel, to make his rule seem divinely ordained. "This crown isn't just gold and gems," he told his son later. "It's a promise, to make Prussia great, and to make the world respect us." With kingship came a new focus on court culture. Frederick wanted Prussia to be known for more than just soldiers and taxes. He poured money into building projects, turning Berlin from a provincial town into a capital worthy of a king. He expanded the royal palace, adding grand halls, marble staircases, and gardens designed by French landscapers. He hired Italian architects to build churches and opera houses, and invited musicians from across Europe to perform at his court. "A king's palace should dazzle," he said, as workmen hung crystal chandeliers in the ballroom. "It tells the world we are not barbarians." Frederick also founded the Prussian Academy of Sciences in 1700, just a year before his coronation. He recruited the brilliant mathematician and philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz to lead it, hoping to make Berlin a center of learning. "Wars win land, but ideas win respect," the king said, as scholars gathered to discuss astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The Academy published books, sponsored research, and helped Prussia catch up with more culturally advanced countries like France and England. Of course, all this splendor cost money, lots of it. Frederick taxed his people heavily to pay for his palaces, parties, and patronage. The nobles grumbled, but the king didn't listen. "A poor king is a weak king," he liked to say. His subjects may not have loved him, but they couldn't deny that Prussia was changing. Foreign diplomats started paying more attention to Berlin, and Prussian officers were invited to serve in other European armies, spreading the reputation of Prussian discipline. International status grew slowly but steadily. During the War of the Spanish Succession, Prussian troops fought bravely alongside the emperor's forces, winning battles in Italy and the Netherlands. When the war ended in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht, Prussia was included in the negotiations, a sign that Europe now saw it as a player. Frederick didn't gain much land, but he gained something more valuable: recognition. "We are no longer a backwater," he told his court. "We are a kingdom, and the world knows it." Not everything went smoothly. Frederick's son, the future Frederick William I, hated his father's extravagance. "All these parties and palaces are a waste," he fumed, watching as his father spent money on a new opera. "We should be spending on soldiers and fortresses." The two clashed constantly, with the son preferring military drills to ballroom dances. But even the son couldn't deny that his father had achieved something important. He had turned a duchy into a kingdom, and made Prussia matter. As Frederick I grew old, he liked to walk through his gardens in Berlin, looking at the new buildings and the busy streets below. "I wanted a crown," he told a friend, "but I got something better, a legacy. My son may not like my parties, but he'll rule a kingdom because of them." When he died in 1713, he left behind a realm that was richer, more respected, and more united than ever before. The crown had been heavy, but Frederick had worn it well. He had shown that Prussia could be more than a military state, it could be a cultural one too. And in doing so, he had laid the groundwork for his successors to turn Prussia into one of Europe's great powers. When Frederick I died in 1713, his son Frederick William I inherited not just a crown, but a kingdom struggling to pay for its own splendor. The new king, tall, gruff, and with a temper as sharp as a bayonet, looked at his father's gilded palaces and shook his head. "All this gold won't defend us from enemies," he grumbled, stripping the royal bed of silk sheets and replacing them with coarse wool. Frederick William had no time for parties or operas. He loved only one thing: soldiers. And under his rule, Prussia would become a nation built around its army, military state, where every penny, every law, and every citizen served the cause of war. Let's step into his world. It's 1720, and the king is visiting a military camp outside Berlin. He's not wearing a crown or a velvet cape, just a simple uniform, stained with mud from riding. He strides through the ranks, stopping to check a soldier's musket, pinching the fabric of a uniform to see if it's thick enough for winter. "This man's boots are worn," he barks at an officer. "Get him new ones by tomorrow, or you'll answer to me." The officer salutes, terrified. Frederick William doesn't just command the army, he lives in it. He eats with the soldiers, drills with them in the rain, and even sleeps in a camp bed when he's on tour. A king who doesn't know his soldiers is no king at all, he tells his sons, who roll their eyes but learn to march anyway. His first mission, make the army bigger and better. When he took the throne, Prussia had about 38,000 soldiers. By the time he died in 1740, that number had grown to 83,000, making Prussia's army the fourth largest in Europe, even though its population was much smaller than France or Austria. How did he do it? He created a system called the canton system, which divided Prussia into districts, cantons, where every young man had to serve in the army for a few years. Farmers, blacksmiths, even nobles, no one was exempt. Every Prussian is a soldier first, the king declared. Peace is just a time to prepare for war. But soldiers cost money, and Frederick William hated waste. He became known as the soldier king, but also as the beggar king for his obsession with saving. He sold his father's art collection, closed down the opera house, and even stopped buying new clothes for himself. His palace in Berlin was so plain that foreign diplomats thought they'd wandered into a barn. "Why spend on frills when we need cannons?" he asked, mending his own socks instead of buying new ones. He also cracked down on tax cheats, sending inspectors to root out nobles who lied about their land holdings. "A tax evader is a traitor to his country," he said, and he meant it. To manage all this, Frederick William built a lean, mean bureaucracy. He created a single office called the General Directory to run the entire country. No more chaos, no more overlapping jobs, just 4 departments, one for war, one for finance, one for justice, and one for police, which meant everything from roads to schools. The men who worked here weren't nobles with fancy titles, they were smart, hard-working commoners who passed tough exams to get the job. "I don't care if your father was a prince," the king told them. "I care if you can count taxes correctly." This system was so efficient that Prussia could collect more money from its small population than much richer countries. He also believed in discipline, everywhere. Soldiers who messed up were flogged, bureaucrats who made mistakes were fired, even his own children got no special treatment. His son Frederick, the future Frederick the Great, hated military drills and loved poetry, which drove the king crazy. "A prince who writes sonnets instead of learning to command is a disgrace," he shouted, once beating Frederick so badly the boy tried to run away. He was caught, and his best friend was executed as punishment, a trauma that would shape Frederick's reign. But for all his harshness, Frederick William's system worked. Prussia's army became famous for its precision. Soldiers could march in perfect formation, fire their muskets in unison, and reload faster than any other troops in Europe. During parades, crowds gasped as 10,000 men moved like a single machine. Foreign generals came to study Prussian tactics, and other countries copied their training methods. "Prussia isn't a country with an army," a French diplomat joked. "It's an army with a country." The king also invested in infrastructure, but only if it helped the army. He built new roads so troops could move quickly, bridges over rivers to speed up marches, and storage depots to keep grain and gunpowder safe. Farmers who grew extra food got tax breaks, because a well-fed army was a strong army. Even schools were told to teach boys math and map reading, skills a soldier might need. "Everything serves the state," the king said, and everyone knew what the state really meant, the army. By the 1730s, Prussia was unrecognizable. Its capital, Berlin, was still small compared to Paris or Vienna, but it was a model of efficiency: clean streets, well-run markets, and soldiers marching everywhere you looked. The treasury was full, thanks to the king's penny pinching, and the army was the envy of Europe. "We may not have palaces," a Prussian merchant told a visitor, "but no one dares attack us. That's worth more than gold." When Frederick William died in 1740, he left his son a kingdom in fighting shape, a powerful army, a full treasury, and a bureaucracy that ran like clockwork. He wasn't loved, people feared him more than admired him, but they respected his strength. "He was a brute," one noble wrote in his diary, "but he made us strong." As the king's coffin was carried through Berlin, soldiers lined the streets, their heads bowed. The new king, Frederick II, walked behind it, wearing a uniform his father would have approved of. He may have hated his father's strictness, but he knew what he'd inherited: a kingdom built on iron and discipline, ready to take its place among Europe's great powers. The soldier king's legacy was secure, and the next chapter of Prussia's story was about to begin. In 1740, a 28-year-old man stood in the palace at Berlin, staring at the crown his father had left him. Frederick II, soon to be called Frederick the Great, was nothing like the soldier king. He loved poetry, played the flute, and corresponded with Voltaire, the famous French philosopher. His father had once called him a sissy for writing sonnets instead of drilling soldiers. But as Frederick slipped on the crown, his eyes narrowed. He may have loved books, but he also knew how to fight. "My father built the sword," he told his advisors. "Now I will wield it." Over the next 46 years, this philosopher king would turn Prussia into a European superpower, winning wars against impossible odds and transforming his realm into a model of Enlightenment governance. Let's start with the first test: Silesia. When the Habsburg Emperor Charles VI died in 1740, his daughter Maria Theresa inherited the Austrian throne. Most of Europe had promised to respect her rule, the pragmatic sanction, but Frederick saw an opportunity. Silesia, a rich province in what is now Poland and the Czech Republic, was part of Maria Theresa's lands. It had coal mines, textile mills, and fertile farms. "Silesia is the key to our future," Frederick told his generals. "With it, we become rich. Without it, we remain small." In December 1740, just 7 months after taking the throne, Frederick marched 40,000 troops into Silesia. No declaration of war, no warning, just a surprise attack. The Austrian army, caught off guard, fled. By spring, most of Silesia was in Prussian hands. Maria Theresa was furious. "This thief will regret stealing my lands," she vowed, rallying her allies. Thus began the First Silesian War, 1740 to 1742, part of the larger War of the Austrian Succession. The fighting was fierce. At the Battle of Malwitz in 1741, Frederick almost lost. His cavalry panicked and fled, leaving his infantry to face the Austrian army alone. But the Prussian soldiers, trained by his father's strict drills, held their ground, firing volley after volley until the Austrians retreated. "I learned that day that discipline wins wars," Frederick later wrote. By 1742, Maria Theresa was forced to sign a treaty: Silesia would stay with Prussia. But she never forgot. "I will get it back," she whispered. She tried in the Second Silesian War, 1744 to 1745, but Frederick outsmarted her again. At the Battle of Hohenfriedberg, he used a new tactic: hiding his troops in a forest, then launching a surprise attack at dawn. The Austrians were routed. By 1748, the war ended with another treaty confirming Prussia's hold on Silesia. Overnight, Prussia's population grew by a third, and its economy boomed with Silesian coal and cloth. Why is Silesia so important? A young cadet might ask Frederick. Because power isn't just about soldiers, the king replied. It's about having the resources to feed them, arm them, and keep them fighting. But the biggest test was yet to come, the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. Maria Theresa, determined to reclaim Silesia, formed a grand alliance against Prussia, Austria, France, Russia, Sweden, and Saxony. It was a nightmare scenario. Prussia, with just 4.5 million people, faced enemies with a combined population of 60 million. "We are surrounded by tigers," Frederick told his brother. "We must bite first." He struck in 1756, invading Saxony to prevent it from joining the alliance. The war that followed was brutal. In 1757, things looked hopeless. Prussia lost 100,000 soldiers in a single year. At the Battle of Rossbach, though, Frederick pulled off a miracle. Outnumbered 2-1 by French and Austrian troops, he used speed and surprise, attacking their flanks and routing them in just 90 minutes. "They thought we were beaten," he said, watching the enemy flee. They were wrong. But 1759 was the year of disasters. At Kunersdorf, a combined Russian-Austrian army crushed Frederick's forces. He lost 20,000 men and came close to suicide. "All is lost," he wrote to his brother. "I will not survive the ruin of my fatherland." But he did. His army, though battered, refused to surrender. Peasants hid soldiers from enemy patrols, women cooked for troops, even children fetched water for the wounded. "Prussia is not a country, it's a spirit," a farmer told a Russian soldier who demanded food. Then, in 1762, luck turned. The Russian Empress Elizabeth died, and her successor, Peter III, was a huge fan of Frederick. He called off the war, returned all conquered Prussian land, and even offered to help fight Austria. "God has sent us a madman," Frederick joked, but he didn't complain. By 1763, the Treaty of Hubertusburg ended the war. Prussia kept Silesia. Europe was stunned. A small kingdom had held off the greatest powers on the continent. While fighting wars, Frederick never stopped reforming his realm. He was an Enlightenment ruler who believed in reason, efficiency, and progress. "A king is the first servant of the state," he said, and he meant it. He worked 14-hour days, reading reports, writing laws, and even designing new farm tools. His legal reforms were revolutionary. He commissioned the Prussian Code, 1794, which abolished torture, guaranteed religious freedom, and made laws the same for nobles and commoners. "Justice should be blind to birth," he said. He invited Jews, Catholics, and Huguenots to settle in Prussia, promising them equal rights. "A skilled Jew is better than a lazy noble," he told a prejudiced advisor. In agriculture, he promoted the potato. Most Prussians thought it was poisonous, but Frederick ordered farmers to grow it. "If you don't," he joked, "I'll send my soldiers to dig up your fields, and they'll eat the potatoes themselves." The potato became a staple, ending famines and feeding his growing population. He also built schools, especially for soldiers' children. "An educated soldier is a better soldier," he said. He founded the Berlin Academy of Sciences and invited scholars from across Europe to teach there. Even Voltaire, despite a falling out with Frederick later, admitted, "He rules like a philosopher, and thinks like a king." Frederick's court at Sanssouci, his summer palace in Potsdam, was a center of culture. He played the flute in concerts, wrote poetry, and discussed philosophy with thinkers. But he never forgot his first love, the army. Every morning, he inspected troops, every evening, he studied battle plans. "I can write a sonnet," he once said, "but I'd rather win a battle." By the time he died in 1786, Prussia was unrecognizable. It had doubled in size, with Silesia as its crown jewel. Its army was the most feared in Europe, and its bureaucracy was the most efficient. Berlin, once a provincial town, was a bustling capital with universities, factories, and elegant palaces. Frederick didn't just rule Prussia, a French diplomat wrote. He made it. As the king's body was laid to rest at Sanssouci, next to his beloved greyhounds, not in a grand mausoleum, Prussians lined the streets. They didn't just mourn a king, they mourned the man who had turned their small, sandy realm into a giant. "He was tough, he was stubborn, but he loved us," an old soldier said, wiping away a tear. Frederick the Great's legacy was clear. Prussia was now a great power, respected, and feared, by all. The philosopher king had proven that brains and brawn could go hand in hand. And his work would set the stage for Prussia to one day unite Germany, and change the course of European history. The year 1806 dawned over Prussia with a false sense of security. For decades, the army had been the pride of the nation, the Prussian machine that Frederick the Great had forged into a fearsome force. Nobles still bragged about their military heritage, officers drilled their troops with the same precision that had won battles 50 years before, and ordinary people believed no enemy could breach their borders. "We are the soldiers of Frederick," a farmer might say, watching troops march through his village. "No one can beat us." But 1806 would shatter that confidence into a million pieces, as a young French general named Napoleon Bonaparte showed the world just how fragile Prussia's greatness had become. Let's set the scene. It's October 14, 1806, near the small towns of Jena and Auerstedt in Saxony. Tens of thousands of Prussian soldiers stand in neat lines, their bayonets glinting in the sun. They wear the same uniforms Frederick's troops wore, carry the same muskets, and fight using the same rigid tactics, marching in tight squares, firing in slow, orderly volleys. Their commanders, mostly elderly nobles who'd inherited their ranks, sit on horses behind the lines, confident in their plan. Across the field, Napoleon's army looks different. Their formations are looser, their soldiers wear shabby blue coats, and their officers dash back and forth, shouting orders. "Look at them," a Prussian colonel scoffs. "They fight like a mob. We'll crush them by noon." But by sunset, the Prussian lines were in ruins. The Battle of Jena-Auerstedt wasn't just a defeat, it was a humiliation. Napoleon's troops moved faster, struck harder, and adapted to the chaos of battle in ways the Prussians couldn't match. His soldiers didn't march in rigid squares, they spread out, using trees and hills for cover. His artillery fired faster, bombarding Prussian lines before their muskets could even reload. At Auerstedt, a Prussian army led by the Duke of Brunswick was crushed by a smaller French force. Brunswick himself was shot through the eye, dying as his troops fled. At Jena, Napoleon personally led his men in a charge that shattered the main Prussian army. "They didn't fight like soldiers," a surviving Prussian private later wrote. "They fought like a storm." Why did it happen? For years, Prussia's army had rested on its laurels. The nobles who ran it refused to change Frederick the Great's tactics, even though war had evolved. They laughed at new ideas like light infantry or rapid artillery movements. Young officers with fresh ideas were ignored. Promotion came from birth, not skill. Meanwhile, Napoleon had revolutionized warfare. He used speed to surprise enemies, mixed infantry, cavalry, and artillery in coordinated attacks, and motivated his troops with the idea of liberty and glory. The Prussians were fighting a 17th-century war against a 19th-century army. The defeat sent shockwaves through Prussia. Napoleon's troops marched unopposed into Berlin, where they paraded through the streets, planting the French tricolor on the palace. King Frederick William III fled east, abandoning his capital. "I have no country left," he wept, as he watched smoke rise from burning towns. The French took everything. They looted the royal treasury, stole art from museums, and even carted off the bronze statue of Frederick the Great's horse from Berlin's main square. "This is what happens to nations that stand in my way," Napoleon declared. Then came the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, which carved Prussia into pieces. Half its territory was taken away. The west became part of the Kingdom of Westphalia, ruled by Napoleon's brother Jerome. The east was given to the Duchy of Warsaw, a French puppet state. What remained of Prussia was forced to pay 140 million francs in war reparations, an impossible sum, and was only allowed to keep an army of 42,000 men. French troops occupied Prussian cities, enforcing the treaty with bayonets. "We are no longer a nation," a Berlin merchant lamented. "We are a French province." The crisis wasn't just military, it was a collapse of the old order. For centuries, Prussia had been run by nobles, junkers, who owned the land, controlled the army, and answered to no one but the king. But Jena Auerstedt exposed their failure, their rigid thinking, their refusal to change, their belief that birth made them better leaders. Ordinary people, farmers, teachers, even some soldiers, started asking questions. "Why do we let these nobles ruin our country?" they whispered. "Why can't a blacksmith's son become an officer if he's brave?" The church, too, lost influence. For years, it had supported the old system, preaching that obedience to kings and nobles was God's will. But now, as French troops burned churches that resisted and priests were forced to swear loyalty to Napoleon, people wondered, where was God in this disaster? Some turned to new ideas, like the Enlightenment thinkers who argued that governments should serve the people, not the other way around. Even the king was forced to confront reality. Frederick William III, once a weak ruler who let nobles run things, now saw that Prussia would die unless it changed. "The old ways are dead," he told his advisors in 1807. "We must rebuild, from the ground up." He started listening to reformers like Baron Stein and Prince Hardenberg, men who argued that Prussia needed to end serfdom, reform the army, and let ordinary people have a say in their government. "A nation can't be strong if half its people are slaves," Stein told the king. But change wasn't easy. The nobles fought back, calling the reformers traitors and French spies. "If we free the peasants, who will work our lands?" they shouted. "If we let commoners be officers, what's left for us?" For a time, it seemed like Prussia might collapse entirely. The economy was in ruins, people starved, and many young men fled to avoid French conscription. Yet in the wreckage, there was a spark of hope. Young officers like Gerhard von Scharnhorst and August Neidhart von Gneisenau gathered in secret, studying Napoleon's tactics and planning to rebuild the army. Teachers and writers started newspapers and schools, urging Prussians to love their country more than their king, and to fight for freedom. Even peasants, though still poor, began to see themselves as Prussians, not just serfs of the Junkers. As 1808 began, Prussia lay broken, but not dead. The old square of nobles, rigid traditions, and outdated tactics had shattered, but from the pieces, something new might rise. "We have been humiliated," a young student wrote in his diary. But humiliation can teach us more than victory. We will rise again, stronger, wiser, and free. In the bitter winter of 1807, Prussia lay under a dark cloud. French soldiers patrolled Berlin streets, the royal family huddled in a small castle in East Prussia, and people whispered that their country would never rise again. But in a drafty office in Königsberg, a 56-year-old man named Heinrich Friedrich Karl von Stein was writing a document that would change everything. "The old order has failed," he scribbled, dipping his pen in ink. "We must burn what is rotten and plant new seeds." Stein, a Rhineland noble with a reputation for bluntness, had just been named chief minister by a desperate King Frederick William III. His mission: save Prussia by destroying the very system that had made it great. What followed was a revolution from above, reforms so bold they would turn a broken kingdom into a nation reborn. Let's start with the most explosive change: ending serfdom. For centuries, most Prussians were serfs, tied to the land, forced to work for nobles, and unable to leave their villages without permission. "A serf is a slave with a nicer name," Stein once said. On October 9, 1807, he issued the October Edict, a document that sent shockwaves through the countryside: all peasants are now free. They may leave their land, marry whom they choose, and own property. Imagine a village in Silesia on the day the edict arrived. A local official reads it aloud in the square, his voice trembling. Old farmers who'd spent their lives working for a noble drop to their knees, weeping. Young men shout, "We're free," and race to pack their bags for Berlin. The noble, pacing in his manor, fumes. "This will ruin us," he tells his wife. "Who will harvest our crops?" But Stein didn't care. He knew a nation of slaves could never fight for freedom. "If a man doesn't own his own hands," he said, "he won't fight to defend his country." Of course, freedom didn't mean prosperity overnight. Peasants still had to pay the nobles for their land, often unfair sums that left them in debt. But over time, the change transformed Prussia. Former serfs became farmers, craftsmen, or soldiers, their labor now fueling the economy instead of enriching a few nobles. "My father couldn't leave the village," a farmer told his son in 1810. "I can go to Berlin and become a blacksmith." That's what Stein gave us. Next, Stein turned to cities. For years, towns were run by a small group of wealthy merchants and nobles, with ordinary people having no say. Stein's Municipal Ordinance of 1808 changed that. Cities would elect their own councils, with representatives from all classes: merchants, craftsmen, even day laborers. Berlin, once ruled by a handful of royal appointees, now had a city council that built schools, cleaned streets, and argued over taxes. "A city that governs itself," Stein said, "is a city that fights for itself." When Stein was forced out in 1808, Napoleon hated his reforms and demanded his dismissal. His work was taken up by Karl August von Hardenberg, a smooth-talking diplomat with a knack for getting things done. Hardenberg focused on economic reforms. He abolished guilds that had monopolized trade, letting anyone start a business. He built roads and canals to connect Prussia's scattered territories. He even created a national bank to stabilize the currency. "We need to make money," he told his advisors, so we can make cannons. But the most vital reforms were in the army, the heart of Prussian identity. Two brilliant officers, Gerhard von Scharnhorst and August Neidhart von Gneisenau, led the charge. They hated the old system, where nobles bought officer positions and commoners were treated like cattle. An army should be a mirror of the nation, Scharnhorst said. Bravery, not birth, should make an officer. Their first move, end the noble monopoly on leadership. In 1808, they opened military academies where any man, peasant, merchant, or noble, could train to be an officer, as long as he passed the exams. A blacksmith's son from Brandenburg might sit next to a junker's son in class, both learning tactics and math. "I never thought I'd call a noble classmate," the blacksmith's son joked, but by graduation, they fought like brothers. They also created the Landwehr, territorial army, a reserve force of ordinary men who trained part-time, keeping their farms or shops but ready to fight when needed. "Every Prussian is a soldier," Gneisenau declared. Farmers practiced shooting on Sundays, teachers drilled with muskets after school. The Landwehr wasn't just an army, it was a statement: this is our country, and we'll defend it together. Meanwhile, education became a weapon of revival. Wilhelm von Humboldt, a scholar with a vision, argued that Prussia needed not just soldiers, but thinkers. In 1810, he founded the University of Berlin, a radical new school where professors could teach whatever they wanted, no royal meddling, and students studied science, philosophy, and history. "We will educate a generation that knows why Prussia is worth saving," Humboldt said. Schools for children popped up too, teaching reading, writing, and, for the first time, Prussian history. "You are not just subjects," teachers told their pupils. "You are Prussians. Remember Jena. Never let it happen again." All these changes sparked a national awakening. For the first time, people thought of themselves as Prussians, not just subjects of the king or peasants of a noble. Poets wrote odes to our fatherland, musicians composed anthems, even women wove flags with the black and white Prussian colors. When French soldiers mocked a group of schoolchildren for singing a patriotic song, the kids pelted them with stones. "They can take our land," a mother said, "but they can't take our pride." By 1812, Prussia was unrecognizable. Serfs were free, cities governed themselves, the army was filled with eager volunteers, and schools taught loyalty to the nation. The French still occupied the land, but the spirit of resistance was alive. "We're not the same country we were in 1806, a soldier wrote to his wife. "We're better. We're ready." Then, in December 1812, news arrived that would change everything. Napoleon's army, which had invaded Russia, was destroyed in the freezing winter. Thousands of French soldiers froze to death, the Grand Army was in ruins. "The tiger is wounded," Stein, now in exile, wrote to the king. Now is the time to strike. Prussia's moment had come. The reforms, serfdom ended, army rebuilt, nation awakened, had turned a broken kingdom into a force ready to fight. The phoenix, it seemed, was rising from the ashes. It was March 17, 1813, and the air in Berlin crackled with electricity. King Frederick William III stood on the steps of the palace, his voice hoarse but steady as he addressed a crowd of thousands. "For 6 years, we have lived under the shadow of foreign rule," he declared, raising a sword. "But today, we rise. Today, we fight for our freedom." The crowd roared, hats flying into the air. Farmers from Brandenburg, their Landwehr uniforms still stiff with new cloth, cheered alongside Berlin merchants and students from the new university. Even children waved small black and white flags, shouting, "Prussia! Prussia!" This was the War of Liberation, Prussia's chance to throw off Napoleon's yoke. After Napoleon's disastrous retreat from Russia in 1812, where his grand army froze to death in the snow, the time was ripe. Prussia signed alliances with Russia, Austria, and Britain, forming a fourth coalition against France. "We are not just fighting for Prussia," the king told his generals. "We are fighting for all of Europe." The first major clash came that October, near the Saxon city of Leipzig. The Battle of Leipzig, dubbed the Battle of the Nations, was unlike anything Europe had seen. Over 500,000 soldiers from 12 nations fought across a 15-mile front: Prussians, Russians, Austrians, Swedes, and even some French defectors, all united against Napoleon's remaining forces. Imagine standing on a hill overlooking the chaos. Cannons boomed like thunder, smoke from muskets blotted out the sun, and the air reeked of gunpowder and blood. Prussia's troops played a crucial role. The Landwehr, those part-time soldiers who'd once been farmers and blacksmiths, fought with a ferocity the French hadn't expected. At one point, a regiment of Prussian infantry charged a French artillery position, their bayonets glinting, shouting, "For freedom," as they overran the guns. "These aren't just soldiers," a French officer gasped. "They're a storm." By the end of the four-day battle, Napoleon's army was in tatters. He fled west, leaving 60,000 dead or captured on the field. Why was Leipzig so important? It was the first time Napoleon had been decisively defeated on German soil. It proved that the reforms, those free peasants, those educated soldiers, that sense of national pride, had worked. "We didn't just win a battle," a Prussian general wrote. "We proved we were a nation again." The Allies pressed their advantage, chasing Napoleon across the Rhine. In March 1814, Prussian troops marched into Paris, this time, as liberators, not prisoners. Crowds lined the streets, some cheering, some weeping. A Prussian soldier from a former serf family stood in front of the Eiffel Tower, still under construction, and laughed. "6 years ago, I couldn't leave my village," he said. "Today, I'm in Paris." Napoleon, forced to abdicate, was exiled to the small island of Elba. But the peace was short-lived. In March 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba, rallied his old soldiers, and marched on Paris. Europe held its breath. "He's back," people whispered. The Allies scrambled to reform their coalition, and Prussia's army, now 250,000 strong, raced to Belgium to meet him. On June 18, 1815, near the Belgian village of Waterloo, the final showdown began. The British, led by the Duke of Wellington, held off Napoleon's attacks all morning, but by afternoon, they were stretched thin. "We need help," Wellington muttered, scanning the horizon. Then, in the distance, he saw them, columns of Prussian soldiers, their black uniforms standing out against the green fields. It was Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher and his Prussian army, who'd marched all night to reach the battle. Blücher's arrival was the turning point. His troops hit Napoleon's right flank, forcing the French to split their forces. "They're here!" Wellington shouted, and his men surged forward. By evening, Napoleon's army was in retreat, routed for the last time. The Prussians chased them for miles, shouting, "No mercy," as they went. "This is for Jena," a Landwehr soldier yelled, bayoneting a French drummer boy. Waterloo wasn't just a victory for Britain, it was a triumph for Prussia. Blücher's timely arrival proved that Prussia's army was once again one of Europe's best. "We didn't just help win the battle," a Prussian officer wrote. "We earned our place at the table." After Waterloo, the Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, redrew Europe's map. Prussia, once a broken state, emerged as a major power. It gained vast territories in the Rhineland and Westphalia, rich, industrial lands that would fuel its economy for decades. Berlin became a center of diplomacy, with Prussian statesmen sitting alongside those from Britain, Austria, and Russia to shape the new Europe. "We are no longer a German principality," the king told his court. "We are a European great power." The changes were visible everywhere. Berlin's population boomed as factories opened in the Rhineland, drawing workers from across Prussia. The army, now a source of national pride, paraded through cities on holidays, with veterans of Leipzig and Waterloo given pride of place. Even the Junkers, those old nobles, adapted, many becoming officers or government officials in the new Prussia. "The world has changed," an elderly Junker told his grandson. "We must change with it." But the most lasting legacy was intangible, a sense of national identity. Prussians no longer thought of themselves as just Brandenburgers or Silesians, they were Prussians, bound by shared sacrifice and victory. "My father fought at Leipzig," a schoolteacher told her class in 1820. "Your fathers fought at Waterloo. This is our story." As the sun set over Berlin in 1815, crowds gathered in the square to celebrate. A band played a new anthem, "Ich bin ein Pruss," I am a Prussian, and people danced in the streets. The king, standing on his palace balcony, smiled. "We have come a long way," he said to his wife. "From Jena to Waterloo, who would have thought it?" Who indeed? Prussia's journey from defeat to victory was nothing short of miraculous. It had taken reforms that freed the people, an army that fought for more than just a king, and a nation that finally believed in itself. The free battles had not just won freedom, they had forged a great power. The year 1815 dawned over Prussia with a warmth that felt like a long overdue embrace. The cannons had fallen silent, the French soldiers were gone, and for the first time in a generation, the country could breathe. From the sandy plains of Brandenburg to the rolling hills of Silesia, and now to the industrial towns of the Rhineland, newly added in the Congress of Vienna, Prussians looked around and saw not just a kingdom, but a nation taking shape. This was no accident. The peace that followed Waterloo would lay the groundwork for something even bigger, a united Germany, with Prussia at its heart. Let's start with the map. Thanks to the Congress of Vienna, Prussia's borders now made sense. Gone were the scattered territories, separated by foreign lands. Now, a continuous block of land stretched from the Rhineland in the west, rich with coal mines, factories, and busy ports like Düsseldorf, to East Prussia in the east, with its fertile farms and strategic position near Russia. Imagine a merchant from Berlin traveling to Cologne in 1820, instead of passing through half a dozen tiny states with their own tolls and currencies, he rides on a new Prussian-built road, pays a single tax, and uses the same coins everywhere. "It's like we're finally one country," he tells his driver, who nods and points to a sign, "Prussian territory, speed limit 10 miles per hour." This territorial integration took work. Prussia's bureaucrats, those efficient, educated men trained in the reforms of Stein and Hardenberg, fanned out across the new lands. They standardized laws. A thief in the Rhineland would be punished the same way as a thief in Brandenburg. They built schools, using Humboldt's model, so that a child in Westphalia learned the same Prussian history as a child in Pomerania. They even standardized weights and measures, so a pound of grain meant the same thing from one end of the kingdom to the other. A country that measures things the same way, a bureaucrat wrote, thinks the same way. The economy boomed, thanks in large part to the Rhineland. Coal from the Ruhr Valley fired up factories that made iron, cloth, and machinery. Rivers like the Rhine carried goods to the Netherlands and beyond, turning cities like Dortmund and Essen into industrial hubs. Prussia, once known mostly for its army, now became a manufacturing powerhouse. My grandfather was a farmer, a factory owner in Essen told his son in 1830. I make steam engines. That's the new Prussia. This economic growth changed society. A new middle class emerged, bankers, factory owners, engineers, who didn't care about noble titles, just talent and hard work. They sent their sons to the University of Berlin, where they studied science and business, not just military strategy. These men would later push for more political rights, arguing that those who pay taxes should have a say in how they're spent. The old nobles, Junkers, grumbled, but they adapted too. Many invested in factories or married into the new middle class, realizing that money and influence mattered more than ancient bloodlines. The army remained the backbone of Prussian identity, but it evolved. The Landwehr, reserve army, stayed, a reminder that every Prussian had a duty to defend the country. Military academies like the one in Berlin continued to train officers based on merit, not birth. A young man from a poor family could still rise to become a general if he was brave and smart, just like Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had dreamed. The army isn't just for fighting, a general told new recruits. It's for uniting us. A soldier from the Rhineland and a soldier from East Prussia, they're both Prussians. Education, too, kept binding the country together. By 1850, nearly every Prussian child attended school, where they learned to read, write, and recite poems about our fatherland. Universities produced not just soldiers and bureaucrats, but scientists, like Robert Koch, who discovered the cause of tuberculosis, and philosophers, like George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who argued that Prussia was the perfect state. We don't just build factories and armies, a teacher said. We build minds. But what about Germany? Most Prussians spoke German, shared similar traditions, and dreamed of a united nation, instead of the 39 tiny states that made up the German Confederation, created by the Congress of Vienna. Prussia and Austria, the two biggest German states, jostled for influence. Austria was older, richer, and had ruled over German lands for centuries. But Prussia had something Austria didn't, a strong sense of national unity, a modern economy, and an army that could back up its ambitions. Small signs of unity appeared. In 1835, Prussia led the way in building the first German railroad, connecting Berlin to Potsdam. Soon, trains crisscrossed the German states, carrying goods, people, and ideas. Newspapers printed in Berlin were read in Munich and Hamburg. Students from across Germany attended Prussian universities. We're more alike than we are different, a student from Bavaria wrote to his Prussian friend. Why can't we be one? Prussia's leaders were careful not to rush. Men like Otto von Bismarck, who would later become Prussia's chancellor, knew that unification would require patience, diplomacy, and sometimes war. The great questions of the day will not be settled by speeches and majority votes, Bismarck once said, but by blood and iron. But in the years after 1815, they laid the groundwork, a strong economy, a powerful army, a shared identity, and a bureaucracy that could govern a large, diverse nation. Ordinary Prussians felt it too. At festivals, They sang songs like Deutschlandlied, Song of Germany, which would one day become Germany's national anthem. When Prussian troops marched in parades, crowds from all German states cheered. "This is our future," an old veteran of Leipzig said, watching his grandson, now a student in Berlin, wave a black and white and red flag, the colors of German unity. Not as Prussians or Bavarians, but as Germans. By 1860, Prussia was ready. Its factories outproduced Austria's, its army was better trained, its people believed in a united Germany. The stage was set for the wars that would finally bring Germany together: the Second Schleswig War, 1864, against Denmark, the Austro-Prussian War, 1866, and the Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871. Each victory brought Prussia closer to its goal. But that's a story for another night. For now, let's end with a quiet moment. It's 1850, and a family sits around a fire in a small village in the Rhineland. The father, a former Landwehr soldier, tells his children about the Battle of Leipzig. The mother, who works in a textile factory, talks about the new railroad that will take her to Berlin. Their oldest son, a student, reads aloud from a book about German history. Outside, the stars shine over a land that is no longer just Prussia, but a nation in waiting. Prussia's journey from a small, sandy realm to a great power was never guaranteed. It took defeats, like Jena, and victories, like Waterloo, reforms that freed people and built armies, and a people who learned to see themselves as more than just subjects. The stones laid in 1815, territory, economy, unity, and purpose, would become the foundation of modern Germany. As the fire dies down, the father looks at his children and smiles. "We built this," he says. "Not with swords alone, but with ideas. With freedom. With hope. And in that hope, the future was already written."